Please explain why God told Abraham to sacrifice his son. I read it in my devotional, and I just don't understand why he would lead him to unalive Isaac, even if he stopped it at last minute. And this is a wonderful question, and I'm excited to try and answer this for you. There's so much that is going on in this one story that it's absolutely beautiful to see it unfold. To get the best picture of this, let's go all the way back to the garden. Adam and Eve. And we all know Eve gets tempted, she sins, Adam sins, and they fall. And before they are kicked out of the garden, God makes a promise. And in short, that promise was that her seed was going to defeat the devil. Depending on your translation, it's either seed or offspring, but we're going to keep seeing talk about this offspring or this seed all throughout the Old Testament. The first one we see is Abel. And in every one of these seeds, we see a foreshadowing of the coming Christ. We see Cain killing Abel because he was jealous. And then it says that Abel's blood cried out from the rocks, just as it tells us later that Jesus' blood will cry out from the rocks. We know that Abel tended to the livestock, and he offered God his first fruits from his livestock, which would have been a lamb. And Cain offered him the works of his hands. So Cain came to God by his own works and offered up the works of his hand. And God loved Abel's offering more, which was the lamb. Wink, wink on the lamb. Now I want you to fast forward to Abraham and his son Isaac, because this is the biggest foreshadowing of Christ. Because as we learn in Galatians chapter 3, I believe it is, Paul makes it clear that the offspring of Abraham is Christ. That's why it never actually says offsprings or seeds. It speaks of one, seed or offspring. So why does God ask Abraham to sacrifice Isaac? Well, I believe the scriptures give us a couple reasons on why. One is going to be what it does for Abraham and the Jewish people. And then two, what it does for prophecy and us in the future. First, let's talk about what it does for Abraham. You see, Paul makes it clear, and so does the Old Testament, that Abraham was accounted righteousness because he believed God. But then there's this moment in Romans 4 where Paul mentions that Abraham has a reason to boast, but not before God, only before men. And by itself, this might seem like, okay, that was random for Paul to mention that. But when we look at what James says, we can piece it together to see something very clear. You see, James makes it clear that Abraham's faith was made complete by his works. So when we ask the question, well, why would God ask Abraham to do this if he knew Abraham was going to do it? And the answer is, it's not for God, because God knows his heart. It is for all that will come after Abraham to trust in who God has chosen. This was a demonstration of his faith for everyone to see. Nobody can question Abraham's faith, can they? I'm pretty sure if I read that story to any human being and make sure there's no bias involved in it, they would say, yeah, that guy definitely has faith. And seeing that the entire people of the Hebrews starts with Abraham and they all are going to look to him as the patriarch, what more of a way to set the standard of saying, this is the faith that I am looking for. So God is using Abraham to demonstrate faith, true faith to us. Not to mention, by doing this, this helps Abraham to solidify his faith. If I have a gas mask when I'm in the Marine Corps and I never actually see it in action, I might not fully trust it. However, if I wear my gas mask in a test environment and I learn, oh, I can trust this, it builds my trust. It builds my faith. God knows he's going to do what he does. Abraham goes to this mountaintop and sees God will provide. Trust me, I will do as I promise. So this is also beneficial to Abraham. And now on top of that, let's look at the foreshadowing and prophecy that happens here. Oh, you ready for this? This is a beautiful one. All right, now real quick, let's go back before Isaac is born, because I want to point something out. Abraham is promised to be the father of a nation, and God says you will have a son. However, his wife gets impatient while waiting for this to come to pass and tells Abraham, have sex with our servant woman because I can't have children. She doubts God, and therefore they have a child out of wedlock with the servant woman. This is the child born into slavery. And then Isaac is born, the chosen seed who was born into freedom. And you can see this imagery that Paul describes in Galatians, I believe it's chapter 3, might be chapter 4. And God asks Abraham to demonstrate his love by doing this. Sacrifice your son for me. Abraham, without question, goes to the mountain, brings Isaac with him, takes him to the top of the mountain, raises his hand up, and before he can bring the knife down, God stops him. God then tells him that he will provide. But if you go back to the beginning of the story, God told him that in the beginning, saying, take your son, I will provide. Now, after God says, I will provide while they're on the mountaintop, suddenly there is a ram in a thicket bush. Now, a thicket bush is going to be full of thorns, and a ram is a male adult lamb. A lamb will grow up to be either a sheep if it's female or a ram if it's male. That mountain, many scholars believe to be the same mountain that Jesus will later die on. Now let me go ahead and run through all that one more time and see if you don't see something very interesting. In the book of Hebrews, the author describes Isaac as Abraham's only begotten son, using the term monogenes, which is the same term used in John 3:16 to describe Jesus. This word is used to identify something as unique because we know that Abraham had another son, Ishmael. So Isaac can't be his literal only begotten son. However, he is the unique and chosen seed. Likewise, Jesus is not a literal born son, but rather the unique Son of God. God asked Abraham to sacrifice his son for him and then stopped him so that he could say, no, I will sacrifice my son for you. It is a demonstration of his sacrifice, because even though he provided that ram in the thicket, a ram in the thicket is an adult lamb with a crown of thorns because the thicket was wrapped around his horns. That is Jesus, who 2,000 years later will die on that very mountain. In other words, scholars believe that Jesus may have been crucified near Moriah or at its summit. Moriah is the place where 2,000 years before Jesus died, the Hebrew patriarch Abraham ascended the mountain with his son Isaac. So when we sit here and ask, why did God do it? There's so much happening here that will affect all types of generations. Yes, in the moment, you might be thinking, why put Abraham through that? However, by that one man's action, there is a ripple effect. Just like when you and I let faith drive us to do things, there is ripple effects. What we see in this story is God saying, I'm asking you to give me your all, but even though I know you can't, I will. When you can't provide, I will. And he lets Abraham keep his son while sacrificing his own. Even though this was the chosen seed, not the illegitimate seed. But the illegitimate seed was allowed to go and was safe. And 2,000 years later, Jesus stood on a stage with Pontius Pilate and Barabbas. And Barabbas basically represents all of us, represents Ishmael, represents all of sinners. And Jesus goes to the cross in his place, the chosen seed that should not have to go to the cross, that should not have to go to the mountaintop, that should not have to, but he did for us.